Some cars were so extreme, so dangerous, and so controversial that history tried to pretend they never existed. Built in secrecy, banned in silence, and erased after scandals and lawsuits, these machines crossed every line the industry had. What survived are fragments, whispers, and disbelief. These are 12 ultra-banned cars, and yes, they were real.
The early Ferrari F40 occupies a very unusual place in American automotive history because it was simultaneously one of the most desired cars in the world and, for several years, effectively illegal to own in the United States in the form Enzo Ferrari intended. This was not a case of obscure bureaucracy or minor paperwork issues. It was a direct collision between old-school, uncompromising Italian engineering and the hard reality of late 1980s U.S. federal safety and emissions law. For a car that was meant to represent Ferrari at its purest and most extreme, America was simply not ready for it. When the F40 was unveiled in 1987, it was conceived as a statement, not a product shaped by regulations. It was built to celebrate Ferrari's 40th anniversary, and more importantly, to be Enzo Ferrari's final word on what a Ferrari should be. Lightweight, brutally fast, stripped of luxury, and focused entirely on performance, the F40 was closer to a road-legal race car than anything Ferrari had sold before or since. It had a twin-turbocharged V8, minimal sound insulation, no power steering, no traction aids, no ABS, and absolutely no interest in emissions compliance beyond what was required in Europe at the time. That philosophy immediately clashed with U.S. law. By the late 1980s, federal regulations required catalytic converters to meet emission standards, and safety rules increasingly expected features like anti-lock braking systems on high-performance vehicles. The F40 had neither. Adding them was not a trivial task. The engine management was primitive by modern standards, tuned aggressively for power and throttle response, and the exhaust system was designed with no margin for emissions hardware. ABS was not simply missing, it was philosophically rejected. Ferrari believed it would dilute the car's purity, add weight, and interfere with the driving experience. As a result, the initial batch of F40s built between 1987 and 1989 could not be legally imported into the United States. There was no official federalized version. Ferrari did not certify the car for U.S. sale, and dealers were not authorized to sell it. Yet demand from American buyers was enormous. Wealthy collectors, celebrities, and hardcore enthusiasts wanted the F40 at any cost, legal or otherwise. That is where the gray market exploded. Gray importers found ways to bring F40s into the U.S. under questionable circumstances. Some cars were imported under exemptions, others under temporary permits, and some were simply smuggled in with paperwork that assumed compliance that did not actually exist. These cars lived in a legal limbo. Owners knew that at any moment, if authorities chose to act, the cars could be seized, impounded, or ordered exported or destroyed. There was real fear, not theoretical fear, of confiscation. Several high-profile cases involving other gray market supercars in the same era reinforced that risk. The situation was especially tense because U.S. customs and regulatory agencies were actively cracking down on illegal imports in the late 1980s. The government was no longer tolerant of exotic cars slipping through loopholes. If an F40 was discovered to lack proper certification, it could be taken without compensation. This turned ownership into a constant balancing act. Some owners barely drove their cars, others kept them hidden, registered under unusual arrangements, or stored them outside the country altogether. Ferrari, meanwhile, found itself in an awkward position. Publicly, the company did not acknowledge the problem in dramatic terms. Privately, it knew that the American market could not be ignored forever. The F40 was too important, too iconic, and too profitable to remain unofficial in the world's largest luxury market.
But modifying the car was dangerous territory. Any change risked undermining its legend. By 1990, Ferrari finally relented. A US-specific version of the F40 was developed and officially certified for sale in 1990-1991. This was not the same car that had stunned the world in 1987. It was altered carefully, quietly, and with as little publicity as possible. Catalytic converters were added, emission systems revised, and ABS was installed to satisfy US safety expectations. The changes increased weight and slightly softened the raw character of the car, even if performance figures remained spectacular on paper. These federalized F40s were legal, insurable, and safe from confiscation. They could be sold openly through official channels. But among purists, they were viewed as compromised. The early non-US F40s were seen as the true expression of Enzo Ferrari's vision, while the US versions were regarded as necessary concessions to bureaucracy. This created a permanent divide in the F40's legacy. Two cars with the same name, built within a few years of each other, one untouchable by law in its pure form, the other legally acceptable but philosophically altered. What makes this episode so remarkable is that the F40 was banned because it was unsafe in a dramatic or scandalous way. It was banned because it refused to participate in the regulatory conversation at all. Ferrari designed the car with American law in mind, and for several years, American law simply said no. This was regulation at its most absolute. No negotiation, no exemptions for legend or prestige. Today, the irony is striking. Early non-US F40s are now legal to import under classic vehicle exemptions, and they are often more valuable than their US spec counterparts. The very features that made them illegal in the late 1980s are now celebrated as proof of their authenticity. But in their own time, these cars lived dangerously, not because of their performance, but because of the law. The early Ferrari F40 in America was not just a forbidden supercar, it was a symbol of a moment when regulation, engineering purity, and global desire collided head-on. For a brief period, one of the greatest cars ever built existed in the United States only in shadows, garages, and whispered conversations, always one inspection away from disappearing. That tension, more than any performance statistic, is what truly defines the F40's early American story.
The Chevrolet Corvette C73 with the L88 engine is one of the most extraordinary contradictions ever produced by an American manufacturer because it was simultaneously a factory-built Corvette, fully assembled and warranted in theory, and a car that General Motors itself did not want on public roads. This was not a rumor, not folklore added later by collectors. It was an explicit internal position. The L88 Corvette was a race car wearing license plate holes, and GM treated it as something that had to be controlled, discouraged, and quietly fenced off from normal customers. To understand why the L88 existed at all, you have to understand GM's corporate schizophrenia in the late 1960s. Officially, GM had agreed to ban factory-backed racing. Publicly, Chevrolet could not admit it was building race cars. Privately, the company was still deeply invested in dominating endurance racing, drag racing, and any series where Corvette could humiliate European competition. The solution was to build a car that was technically available to the public, but only to the right public. The L88 was that solution. Introduced in 1967 and offered through 1969, the L88 option transformed the Corvette into something barely recognizable as a street car. On paper, the engine was listed as producing 430 horsepower. This number was deliberately false. GM engineers knew it, races knew it. Anyone serious enough to order an L88 knew it. In reality, the engine made somewhere between 550 and 580 horsepower in stock form, depending on tuning and exhaust.
The reason for the understatement was simple: insurance companies, regulators, and internal politics. A Corvette openly rated at nearly 600 horsepower would have triggered scrutiny GM did not want. The L88 engine itself was brutally uncompromising. It ran extremely high compression, around 12.5 to 1, making it completely incompatible with normal pump gasoline. It required 103-octane racing fuel just to survive. The camshaft was so aggressive that idle quality was barely tolerable. At low speeds, the engine ran hot, rough, and unhappy. It was not designed to cruise. It was designed to live at high RPM on long straights and under sustained load. Cooling was upgraded dramatically because without it, the engine would destroy itself. The aluminum cylinder heads alone marked it as something special and expensive, even by Corvette standards. Everything else about the L88 Corvette reinforced the message that this car did not belong on the street. Power steering was deleted, power brakes were deleted, air conditioning was not available, even a radio was technically optional, and many cars were ordered without one. This was not cost-cutting, it was intentional discomfort. GM wanted the L88 unpleasant enough in daily use that casual buyers would walk away. The suspension was stiff, the clutch was heavy, and the exhaust was deafening. Driving an L88 in traffic was an act of masochism. Then came the internal ban, the part that truly separates the L88 from any other Corvette. Chevrolet explicitly instructed dealers not to sell L88-equipped cars to ordinary customers. Dealers were warned that the engine was not suitable for street use, that warranty coverage would be effectively meaningless, and that misuse could result in catastrophic failure. Buyers were required to acknowledge in writing that the car was intended for competition and not for public roads. This was not a legal ban enforced by the government. It was a factory-imposed restriction, a recognition that the car existed outside the normal rules of consumer automobiles. In effect, GM created a filter. Only serious racers, teams, or deeply connected insiders could realistically obtain an L88. You did not wander into a Chevrolet showroom and order one on impulse. You needed credibility. Dealers often demanded proof that the buyer was involved in racing. Some refused to sell the option at all. Others quietly steered customers toward lesser engines, warning them that the L88 would be miserable, unreliable, and unsupportable. This was deliberate. GM wanted the L88 in the hands of people who would use it as intended, on tracks, not highways. The irony is that the L88 was never officially illegal to drive on the street. There was no federal ban, no DOT prohibition, no emissions rule that singled it out directly in its brief production window. But functionally, it was self-banned. GM made it clear that if you tried to use it like a normal car, you were on your own. No sympathy, no protection, no illusions. This was as close as a major American automaker ever came to saying, "We built this, but we do not want to see it driven where normal people drive." On track, the L88 justified everything. It dominated endurance racing, including Le Mans, Sebring, and Daytona, humiliating competitors that cost far more and came from far more prestigious racing lineages. The engine's true power output, combined with the Corvette's relatively low weight and excellent high-speed stability, made it a monster. Racers loved it because it was brutally honest. It did not pretend to be friendly. It existed to win. By 1969, the era that allowed the L88 was closing. Emissions regulations, insurance crackdowns, and changing corporate policies made such a car impossible going forward. The L88 disappeared quietly, never replaced by anything quite like it. Later high-performance Corvettes would be fast, even extreme, but they would always pretend to be street cars. The L88 never bothered with that lie. Today, the L88 Corvette is revered not just for its performance, but for what it represents. It is proof that for a brief moment, General Motors knowingly sold a factory-built race car to the public, while simultaneously trying to prevent the public from using it publicly.
It is a car that came with an internal warning label, an understanding between manufacturer and buyer that this machine lived outside the normal social contract of automobiles. In that sense, the L88 was not banned by law, but it was banned by intent. It was a Corvette that General Motors built reluctantly, sold selectively, and disowned quietly, all while knowing it was one of the most capable and honest performance cars America ever produced. That internal ban, that unspoken acknowledgement that the car was too much for the world it was sold into, is exactly why the L88 remains legendary.
The early Lamborghini Countach LP400 is one of those cars that forces you to accept an uncomfortable truth about extreme performance machines of the 1970s. Sometimes the limiting factor was not regulation, not safety law, not even engineering competence, but physics itself. The LP400 did not merely stretch the boundaries of what a road car could be. It stepped so far beyond existing infrastructure and component technology that without a bespoke solution, it became effectively undrivable. In that sense, the car was never banned by governments. It was banned by reality, and only one very specific tire made it survivable. When the Countach LP400 appeared in 1974, it was nothing like the supercars that preceded it. The Miura, for all its drama, still relied on relatively conventional proportions and components. The Countach was a wedge-shaped shock weapon, impossibly low, impossibly wide, with a longitudinally mounted V12 pushed forward of the rear axle, and a chassis that prioritized rigidity and geometry over compliance. Its suspension geometry was aggressive even by racing standards, with minimal travel and extremely sharp responses. Everything about the car assumed levels of grip and stability that simply did not exist in off-the-shelf road tires of the era. That was the problem. Tire technology in the early 1970s was still catching up to muscle cars, let alone something like the Countach. Most high-performance road tires were relatively tall profile designs with flexible sidewalls and construction methods inherited from an earlier, slower era. Mounted on the Countach, these tires were not just inadequate, they were dangerous. The car's steering was unassisted, brutally direct, and hypersensitive to changes in grip. The rear weight bias and immense V12 torque meant that any sudden loss of traction at the back could escalate instantly into snap oversteer. On tires that could not maintain a stable contact patch under load, the Countach could turn from stable to lethal with almost no warning. Lamborghini quickly realized that selling the LP400 without a dedicated tire solution was irresponsible, even by the standards of the time. The car was not forgiving enough to tolerate the compromises inherent in existing rubber. The solution did not come from within Lamborghini, but from Pirelli, which was already pushing the limits of tire engineering. What Pirelli created specifically for the Countach was the P7, a tire that would redefine what a performance tire could be. The P7 was revolutionary. It was the world's first ultra-low-profile radial tire with dramatically reduced sidewall height compared to anything available for road use at the time. This was not a styling exercise. The low profile dramatically reduced sidewall flex, allowing the tire to maintain a consistent contact patch under extreme lateral and longitudinal loads. Steering response became predictable rather than nervous. High-speed stability improved dramatically. Most importantly, breakaway behavior became progressive instead of sudden. On the P7, the Countach would still punish mistakes, but it would at least communicate what was happening before killing you. Without the P7, the LP400's behavior bordered on uncontrollable. Contemporary testers and owners describe the car as terrifying on unsuitable tires, especially at speed or on uneven surfaces. The combination of stiff suspension, light weight, and massive power meant that the car could literally skip across bumps, losing grip in ways that felt random and unrecoverable. Braking from high speed was equally fraught because mismatched or inadequate tires could not cope with the load transfer, causing instability that made threshold braking a gamble. It is no exaggeration to say that in its early years, the Countach was a car whose safe operation depended on a single, specific tire model. This is almost unheard of for a production road car. Most cars can tolerate a range of tires within a given size and rating. The Countach could not. Fit the wrong tires, and you were no longer driving a supercar. You were piloting a barely contained accident in search of a location. This created a peculiar unspoken form of prohibition. While no law forbade the Countach from being driven on public roads, experienced owners, mechanics, and dealers understood that driving it without Pirelli P7s was reckless to the point of insanity. In practical terms, physics imposed its own ban. The car demanded technology that barely existed, and until that technology was created, the Countach existed in a dangerous gray zone between genius and catastrophe. The broader significance of the P7 and the LP400 cannot be overstated. The tire did not just save the Countach, it changed the entire trajectory of high-performance road cars. Ultra-low-profile tires became the norm for supercars and eventually for high-performance sedans and sports cars of all kinds. The Countach forced the tire industry to evolve faster than it otherwise would have, and the P7 became the blueprint for everything that followed. Looking back, the early Countach LP400 feels like a machine that arrived too early for the world it entered. Its design assumed materials, tires, and driver expectations that would not become common for decades. In that sense, it was never truly meant for the roads of the 1970s. It survived only because Pirelli was willing to invent something entirely new to keep it alive. So, while the Countach was never banned by regulators, it was constrained by something far more absolute. The laws of physics drew a hard line, and only one very specific solution allowed the car to cross it. Without the P7, the LP400 was not just difficult, it was fundamentally incompatible with safe driving. That silent, invisible ban is part of what makes the early Countach not just legendary, but unsettling even today.
The Ferrari 250 GTO occupies a rare and uncomfortable category in racing history because it was not pushed aside due to danger, cost, scandal, or politics in the usual sense. It was pushed aside because it worked too well. In the early 1960s, when motorsports still pretended that gentlemanly balance and technical variety mattered, the GTO exposed a brutal truth. If the rules allowed it, Ferrari could build a car so perfectly optimized that everyone else became irrelevant. The response was not to beat the GTO, but to erase the conditions that allowed it to exist. When the 250 GTO debuted in 1962, it was already an anachronism and a weapon at the same time. Officially, it was a Group 3 Grand Touring car, meaning it was supposed to be closely related to a production road model. In reality, it was a thinly disguised prototype wearing just enough legality to pass scrutineering. Ferrari exploited every ambiguity in the homologation rules. The chassis was based on the older 250 GT SWB. The engine was a heavily evolved Colombo V12, and the bodywork was pure function, shaped by wind tunnel testing, at a time when most rivals were still sketching by intuition. From the moment it appeared, the GTO dominated endurance racing. At Le Mans, it was never about outright victory, because prototypes like the Ferrari 330 TRI LM, or later the Ford-powered Monsters, were faster in a straight line. What mattered was class dominance and overall threat. The GTO was reliable, fast enough, perfectly balanced, and brutally consistent over 24 hours. It won the GT class at Le Mans repeatedly, and more importantly, it finished high overall while embarrassing far more powerful machinery. From 1962 through 1964, the GTO became the default answer to endurance racing. If you wanted to win your class and threaten the leaders, this was the car. That success created a problem, not for Ferrari, but for the organizers. The 24 Hours of Le Mans was not just a race, it was a political ecosystem.
Manufacturers needed reasons to participate. Variety mattered. The spectacle mattered. When one car became too dominant, especially one that relied on clever interpretation of rules rather than obvious technological leaps, it undermined the balance the organizers were trying to maintain. The GTO was not breaking the rules, but it was making the rules look foolish. By 1964, patience was gone. The Automobile Club de l'Ouest and the FIA began reshaping the technical regulations in ways that were subtle on paper but devastating in effect. Homologation requirements were tightened. The definition of what constituted a production GT car was clarified in a way that directly attacked the GTO's foundations. Ferrari had famously argued that the GTO was merely an evolution of an existing model, not a new one requiring full production numbers. Regulators had tolerated this fiction while it was convenient. After years of GTO dominance, they stopped pretending. The new rules favored either true prototypes or genuinely mass-produced GT cars. The GTO fell into a dead zone between the two. It was too specialized to qualify cleanly as a production car under the revised standards, and too constrained to compete as a prototype against increasingly powerful purpose-built machines. On paper, the car was still legal in some contexts. In practice, it was finished. The regulations did not name the Ferrari 250 GTO, but everyone understood who the target was. This is why calling it a ban is not exaggeration, but also not literal. No official document declared the GTO forbidden. Instead, the regulatory environment was altered so precisely that the car's competitive window slammed shut. It was regulatory suffocation. The organizers removed the oxygen, knowing exactly which car would stop breathing. When the Ferrari 250 GTO debuted in 1962, it was already an anachronism and a weapon at the same time. Officially, it was a Group 3 Grand Touring car, meaning it was supposed to be closely related to a production road model. In reality, it was a thinly disguised prototype wearing just enough legality to pass scrutineering. Ferrari exploited every ambiguity in the homologation rules. The chassis was based on the older 250 GT SWB, the engine was a heavily evolved Colombo V12, and the bodywork was pure function, shaped by wind tunnel testing, at a time when most rivals were still sketching by intuition. From the moment it appeared, the GTO dominated endurance racing. At Le Mans, it was never about outright victory, because prototypes like the Ferrari 330 TRI LM, or later the Ford-powered monsters, were faster in a straight line. What mattered was class dominance and overall threat. The GTO was reliable, fast enough, perfectly balanced, and brutally consistent over 24 hours. It won the 1952 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, in its pure racing form, sits at a strange, almost forgotten intersection between what was technically possible and what was socially acceptable for a road car in the early post-war world. This was not a case of a car being outlawed by regulation, nor rejected by customers. It was something more fundamental. Mercedes-Benz itself decided that what it had created was simply too advanced, too powerful, and too expensive to ever be offered to the public in its original form. In that sense, the car was forbidden not by law, but by reality, and by the manufacturer's own restraint. To understand why, you have to go back to what Mercedes-Benz was trying to achieve in 1952. Germany was still rebuilding its industrial identity after the war, and Mercedes wanted a return to international prestige, not incremental respectability. The W194 race car, which would later give birth to the 300 SL name, was designed as a technological declaration. Lightweight tubular space frame construction, extreme aerodynamic efficiency, and an engine tuned for sustained high-speed endurance racing rather than polite road use. This was not meant to be a stepping stone toward a production car. It was meant to win and to announce that Mercedes-Benz was back. The version entered in the Mille Miglia was especially radical. Endurance racing on Italian public roads demanded not only speed, but relentless reliability at high load for hundreds of miles. For this, Mercedes employed a racing engine derived directly from its competition program, featuring mechanical fuel injection. At the time, this was exotic even by racing standards. The 1952 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, in its pure racing form, sits at a strange, almost forgotten intersection between what was technically possible and what was socially acceptable for a road car in the early post-war world. This was not a case of a car being outlawed by regulation, nor rejected by customers. It was something more fundamental. Mercedes-Benz itself decided that what it had created was simply too advanced, too powerful, and too expensive to ever be offered to the public in its original form. In that sense, the car was forbidden not by law, but by reality, and by the manufacturer's own restraint. To understand why, you have to go back to what Mercedes-Benz was trying to achieve in 1952. Germany was still rebuilding its industrial identity after the war, and Mercedes wanted a return to international prestige, not incremental respectability. The W194 race car, which would later give birth to the 300 SL name, was designed as a technological declaration. Lightweight tubular space frame construction, extreme aerodynamic efficiency, and an engine tuned for sustained high-speed endurance racing rather than polite road use. This was not meant to be a stepping stone toward a production car. It was meant to win and to announce that Mercedes-Benz was back. The version entered in the Mille Miglia was especially radical. Endurance racing on Italian public roads demanded not only speed, but relentless reliability at high load for hundreds of miles. For this, Mercedes employed a racing engine derived directly from its competition program, featuring mechanical fuel injection. At the time, this was exotic even by racing standards. Carburetors still dominated almost everything on wheels. Fuel injection was expensive, complex, and temperamental, but it delivered precise fuel metering, superior throttle response, and power output that simply could not be matched consistently by carbureted engines under race conditions. In the Mille Miglia configuration, the 300 SL was brutally effective. It combined high top speed with extraordinary fuel efficiency and durability. That combination mattered in a race where refueling strategy could decide the outcome as much as outright speed. The car's performance was not just impressive, it was intimidating, and that intimidation extended beyond competitors to Mercedes-Benz itself. From a public perspective, it would seem logical to turn such a machine into a production car immediately, but that was never realistic in 1952. The racing engine was not suitable for everyday use. Its tolerances were tight, its operating demands unforgiving, and its cost astronomical. Mechanical fuel injection at that time required skilled technicians, careful calibration, and constant maintenance. Even for wealthy buyers, ownership would have been impractical. For Mercedes-Benz, offering such a car to the public would have risked catastrophic reputational damage if customers encountered failures they could neither understand nor afford to fix. There was also the question of power and behavior. The racing engine delivered performance that went far beyond what contemporary roads, tires, and drivers could safely accommodate. Post-war infrastructure was poor, tires were primitive, braking systems were still evolving. A car with racing-level power and response would have been uncontrollable for most drivers, not because they lacked skill, but because the environment simply could not support it. Mercedes-Benz understood this. The company had no interest in creating a public disaster wrapped in a silver star. As a result, these racing 300 SLs were never offered for sale. They were not prototypes in the usual sense. They were complete, functional machines that could have been sold if Mercedes had wanted to, but they were effectively forbidden from entering civilian life. Too extreme, too specialized, too far ahead of their time. The decision to keep them within the racing program was deliberate and cautious, reflecting a corporate culture that valued long-term prestige over short-term spectacle. What makes this story so important is what happened next. Instead of abandoning the technology, Mercedes-Benz chose to domesticate it. The lessons learned from the W194 and its Mille Miglia engine were filtered, softened, and re-engineered for a road-going application. The tubular space frame was retained, but adapted for comfort and durability. The fuel injection system was refined, simplified, and made serviceable. Power output was moderated. Reliability was prioritized. The result was the 1954 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, a car that stunned the world not because it was uncontrollable, but because it made racing technology livable. Even then, the Gullwing was expensive, demanding, and exotic, but it was no longer forbidden. It was a controlled release of something that had once been dangerous, too costly, and too advanced to exist outside competition. The original 1952 racing versions remain in a separate category entirely. They are not road cars that became racers, they are race cars that refused to become road cars. In hindsight, this restraint is part of what makes the 300 SL legend so powerful. Mercedes-Benz did not simply unleash its most extreme creation on the public and let consequences follow. It recognized the gap between possibility and responsibility. The racing 300 SL with its injected engine represented the future, but a future that needed time to mature. So, while these cars were never banned in any legal sense, they were absolutely forbidden in practice. Forbidden by cost, by complexity, by infrastructure, and by Mercedes-Benz's own understanding of what the public could realistically handle. The fact that their technology eventually shaped one of the greatest road cars ever built does not diminish that truth, it reinforces it. The 1952 300 SL was a machine the world was not yet ready for, and Mercedes-Benz knew it.
The Tucker 48 is one of the darkest and most uncomfortable stories in American automotive history because it forces you to confront the idea that a car can be killed not by the market, not by regulators acting in good faith, and not by technical failure, but by concentrated industrial power protecting itself. The Tucker was not banned by a law written in public. It was banned by pressure, influence, and a system quietly turned hostile to anything that threatened the established order. What happened to Preston Tucker was not an accident. It was a warning. In 1948, the American auto industry was effectively a closed kingdom. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler controlled production capacity, suppliers, dealerships, advertising, political access, and public trust. After World War II, Americans were desperate for new cars, and the Big Three were more than happy to sell them warmed-over pre-war designs with minor updates. Innovation was not urgent. Competition was not welcome. Stability, predictability, and control were everything. Into this environment walked Preston Tucker, an outsider with dangerous ideas. Tucker did not want to build just another car. He wanted to leapfrog the industry. His vision for the Tucker 48 was radical not because it chased speed or luxury, but because it treated safety as a primary design principle decades before that became normal. This alone made him a threat. Safety does not sell easily unless people are forced to care about it. Tucker intended to force the issue. The Tucker 48 introduced features that sound normal today, but were shocking in 1948. The most famous was the centrally mounted third headlight, nicknamed the Cyclops Eye, mechanically linked to the steering so it illuminated the direction of travel when turning. At a time when night driving was genuinely dangerous, this was a meaningful advance. The dashboard was padded, not decorative, designed to reduce injury in a crash. The windshield was designed to pop out in an impact, preventing decapitation or severe head trauma. The car was engineered with a reinforced safety cell and crash-conscious interior layout.
Even seatbelts were discussed, an idea most manufacturers dismissed outright as an admission that their cars were dangerous. These ideas terrified the Big Three far more than any engine specification ever could. If Tucker succeeded, he would redefine expectations. Once the public saw safety features working, pressure would mount on established manufacturers to follow. That meant redesigns, retooling, and cost. It meant admitting that for decades they had ignored safety entirely. It meant lawsuits. It meant loss of control. The Tucker 48 was not just safer, it was also mechanically unconventional. Early versions used a rear-mounted engine, independent suspension, and disc brakes were openly discussed for future models. The design was fluid, evolving rapidly, which critics later used against Tucker, but this was exactly how innovation works. Unfortunately, innovation does not survive well in hostile territory. From the beginning, Tucker faced resistance that went far beyond skepticism. Suppliers were pressured not to work with him, dealership networks refused to cooperate, media coverage became increasingly negative, framing Tucker as a dreamer at best and a fraud at worst. Rumors circulated constantly about instability, financial impropriety, and technical impossibility. Many of these stories originated from sources closely aligned with the established manufacturers. The decisive blow came through the Securities and Exchange Commission. Tucker was accused of stock fraud, accused of selling shares and dealer franchises for a car that was supposedly not production-ready. This accusation ignored a critical reality. Almost every major automaker in history financed early growth through promises and projections. Ford, GM, and Chrysler had all done versions of the same thing in their early years. The difference was that they were not challenging entrenched giants when they did it. The SEC investigation froze Tucker's finances. Production slowed to a crawl. Suppliers vanished. Legal fees mounted. The company collapsed under the weight of scrutiny alone. In court, Tucker was eventually acquitted of fraud. The jury found that he had acted in good faith and that there was no criminal intent. But the acquittal came too late. The damage was already done. The company was bankrupt. The factory was silent. Only 51 cars had been completed. This is where the word banned becomes accurate in spirit, if not in statute. The Tucker 48 was not outlawed, it was made impossible. It was legislated out of existence through selective enforcement, regulatory aggression, and financial strangulation. The Big Three never had to openly kill it, they simply ensured it could not survive. The cruelty of the story is compounded by what happened afterward. Many of Tucker's ideas quietly reappeared across the industry in the following decades. Padded dashboards became standard, safety glass became mandatory, steering-linked lighting concepts resurfaced in various forms. Crash safety became a selling point. The industry adopted the future Tucker tried to introduce, but only after ensuring he would not be the one to profit from it. The Tucker 48 itself proved that the car was real, functional, and viable. Surviving examples drive today. They are not fantasies, they're not mock-ups. They are proof that Tucker was not a con man, but a man ahead of his time in a system that could not tolerate disruption. What makes the Tucker story so disturbing is that it contradicts the comforting myth of free market innovation. The best idea did not win. The safest car did not win. The most forward-thinking design did not win. Power won. Access won. Influence won. The Tucker 48 was not defeated by consumers rejecting it. It was never given the chance. In that sense, the Tucker 48 stands alongside the most quietly forbidden cars in history. Not banned by a rulebook, not condemned by a safety test, but erased by pressure applied where the public could not see it. Preston Tucker tried to change the trajectory of the American automobile in one leap, instead of 100 cautious steps. For that, his car was never allowed to live. Today, the Tucker 48 is remembered as a legend, a martyr, and a warning. It reminds us that innovation is only celebrated when it comes from the right people, at the right time, and without threatening those who already own the future. The immediate post-war fate of the Volkswagen Beetle in Germany is one of the clearest examples of a car being suppressed not because of technology, safety, or economics, but because of symbolism. In the years right after World War II, the Beetle was not just a vehicle, it was a political artifact, inseparable from the regime that had conceived it. For a time, that association alone was enough to stop it from existing at all. When Allied forces took control of Germany in 1945, the Wolfsburg factory lay damaged, underutilized, and ideologically contaminated in the eyes of the victors. The Volkswagen project had been personally championed by Adolf Hitler as the Kraft durch Freudewagen, the strength through joy people's car. It was propaganda on wheels, meant to symbolize technological modernity, national unity, and the promise of prosperity under National Socialism. Although very few civilians ever received one before the war, the idea was powerful. That made the Beetle radioactive in the immediate aftermath of Nazi defeat. The Allied occupation authorities initially banned civilian automobile production across much of Germany, focusing instead on demilitarization, reparations, and basic survival. But Wolfsburg was treated with particular suspicion. To many Allied planners, Volkswagen was not just another factory, it was a Nazi prestige project. Allowing it to resume production risked appearing to rehabilitate or legitimize the imagery of the defeated regime. In that climate, the Beetle was not viewed as a neutral object, it was viewed as ideological residue. There were also practical reasons wrapped tightly around political ones. Germany was devastated, roads were destroyed, fuel was scarce, and civilian car ownership seemed irrelevant, even obscene, in the face of widespread hunger and homelessness. From the Allied perspective, restarting mass car production looked wasteful and unnecessary. In some circles, there were serious discussions about dismantling the Wolfsburg plant entirely and shipping its machinery abroad as war reparations. British officials even attempted to sell the factory to foreign manufacturers, including Ford, which famously declined, reportedly calling the project economically unviable. For several years, the Beetle existed in a strange limbo. The design was intact, the factory was physically there, the car could be built, but it was effectively forbidden, not by a single written law, but by occupation policy and ideological discomfort. What little production did occur was tightly controlled and strictly utilitarian. Early post-war Beetles were built primarily for Allied forces themselves, not for German civilians. British military authorities overseeing the region authorized limited production to provide transport for occupation administration, postal services, and essential workers. The irony was striking. A car conceived as a Nazi symbol survived by serving the very forces that had defeated the regime that created it. Even then, the Beetle was stripped of its symbolism. It was not marketed, it was not celebrated, it was simply tolerated as a useful machine. There was no talk of reviving Volkswagen as a national brand. In fact, the very name carried uncomfortable weight. The idea that Germans might once again rally around a people's car so soon after the war was deeply unsettling to Allied planners. The turning point came slowly as the geopolitical landscape changed. By the late 1940s, the focus of the Allies shifted from punishment to reconstruction. The emerging Cold War made a stable, economically viable West Germany strategically essential. Industry was no longer the enemy, it was the solution. In that context, Wolfsburg stopped being a symbol of the past and started to look like an asset for the future. In 1949, control of the Volkswagen plant was handed over to the newly established government of West Germany. With that transfer, the unspoken ban was lifted. The Beetle was no longer a Nazi project. It was rebranded as a civilian tool for rebuilding a shattered society. The same basic car that had once been wrapped in authoritarian propaganda was recast as a symbol of recovery, humility, and mechanical honesty. What followed was one of the most remarkable rehabilitations in industrial history. The Beetle's origins were quietly downplayed. Its simplicity, durability, and affordability were emphasized instead. In international markets, especially later in the United States, the car was deliberately positioned as the opposite of authoritarian excess. It was modest, friendly, self-deprecating. Advertising leaned into understatement and even humor, erasing any lingering association with its ideological birth. But that transformation only happened because the car was first stopped. The early post-war ban, informal though it was, created a clean break. It allowed the Beetle to be reborn under a different political and moral framework. Without that pause, without that period of suppression, it is entirely possible that the Beetle would have remained permanently tainted by its origins and never achieved global acceptance. In this sense, the Beetle was not banned because it was dangerous, flawed, or obsolete. It was banned because it meant too much. Its shape carried history that was still too raw to confront. Only when Germany itself was politically redefined could the car be allowed to exist again. The irony is profound. A vehicle conceived as a tool of propaganda survived the collapse of its ideology, outlived the regime that created it, and went on to become one of the most beloved cars in the world. But that outcome was not inevitable. For several crucial years, the Beetle was a forbidden object, locked behind political reality rather than mechanical limitation. Its eventual success was built not just on engineering, but on the willingness of history to let it have a second life.
The Shelby Cobra 427 Super Snake exists at the absolute edge of what can reasonably be called an automobile. It is not merely fast, not merely dangerous, but fundamentally incompatible with the idea of public road use. This was not a car that regulators banned, or insurers refused, or manufacturers quietly withdrew. It was a car that the laws of physics themselves rejected. Carroll Shelby did not so much build it as dare reality to stop him, and reality responded immediately. By 1966, the standard Cobra was already infamous. Even the normal 427 Cobra, with around 425 horsepower and a chassis weighing barely more than a ton, was considered borderline insane. It demanded constant attention, punished mistakes without mercy, and frightened experienced drivers. Most manufacturers would have stopped there. Shelby did the opposite. He escalated. The Super Snake was conceived as a personal experiment, a rolling act of defiance. Shelby wanted to see just how far the Cobra concept could be pushed before it collapsed under its own excess. The answer was found by taking a full competition-spec 427 cubic-inch V8, originally intended for racing, and forcing it into a road-registered car. Not content with that, Shelby fitted twin Paxton superchargers. The result was an engine producing around 800 horsepower, possibly more depending on boost, in a car that had no traction control, no stability aids, no power steering, no anti-lock brakes, and tires that were laughably inadequate even by mid-1960s standards. The Cobra chassis was never designed for this. It had already been stretched to its limits handling the regular 427 engine. With Super Snake power, it became a barely contained explosion. Throttle response was violent and unpredictable. Power arrived instantly and brutally, overwhelming the rear tires at almost any speed. The car could spin its wheels at highway speeds with a casual squeeze of the accelerator. Grip was not something you managed, it was something you briefly borrowed before it vanished. Only 2 Super Snakes were ever built. One was retained by Shelby himself. The other was sold to Bill Cosby, who at the time was a major celebrity and friend of Shelby.
Cosby's experience with the car became legendary, not because it was enjoyable, but because it terrified him so completely that he refused to keep it. He later described the car as trying to kill him. This was not exaggeration. During a test drive, the car reportedly went out of control so violently that Cosby barely escaped serious injury. He returned the car to Shelby almost immediately, shaken and done. No celebrity bravado, no ego, just fear. That reaction is telling. Cosby was not an inexperienced driver. He was not reckless or naive. He was simply confronted with a machine that exceeded human reaction time. The Super Snake did not give warnings. It did not gradually approach the limit. It crossed it instantly. At speed, a slight throttle input could result in massive torque spikes that sent the rear end sideways without warning. Recovery required reflexes, space, and luck, and even then there were no guarantees. Shelby himself understood this. Despite his reputation for bravado, he was pragmatic when it mattered. He did not attempt to sell more Super Snakes. He did not promote it as a production model. He did not try to civilize it. The experiment had spoken. The car was too much. Not in a marketing sense, but in a fundamental mechanical sense. It exceeded the ability of contemporary tires, suspension geometry, braking systems, and human drivers to coexist safely. What makes the Super Snake especially significant is that it was not illegal. It could be registered. It could be insured, at least in theory. There were no emissions laws yet to stop it, no horsepower caps, no electronic oversight. If Shelby had wanted to, he could have tried to sell it. But he didn't because legality was irrelevant. Survival was the issue. This is why the Super Snake is often described as banned by physics. It exposed a hard limit that could not be negotiated. The relationship between power, weight, grip, and control had been broken. No amount of courage could fix it. No amount of skill could reliably tame it. The car was not challenging. It was hostile. The ultimate proof lies in what happened afterward. Performance cars continued to evolve, but never in this direction again. Power increases were accompanied by wider tires, better suspension design, improved aerodynamics, and eventually electronic controls. The industry learned that raw horsepower alone was meaningless if it could not be deployed. The Super Snake was the cautionary tale written in rubber smoke and near-death experiences. Today, the surviving Super Snake is one of the most valuable cars in the world, not because it represents a pinnacle to be admired, but because it represents a boundary that was crossed and never crossed again. It is valuable precisely because it is unusable. It is a museum piece, a historical artifact from a time when someone was reckless enough, brilliant enough, and curious enough to build something that should not exist. The Shelby Cobra 427 Super Snake was not misunderstood. It was understood perfectly, almost immediately. It was not ahead of its time, it was beyond its time, and in that narrow, terrifying gap between possibility and control, physics issued its own ban. The DeLorean DMC-12 occupies one of the strangest and most sensational chapters in automotive history. A case where the car's fate was dictated not by engineering, market failure, or regulatory oversight, but by the criminal and legal turbulence surrounding its founder. In many ways, the DMC-12 became banned not in law, but by circumstance. Once John DeLorean's arrest rocked the company, production ground to a halt, leaving a car that was already rare even before the saga unfolded. The DeLorean Motor Company was conceived as a radical, almost cinematic idea. John DeLorean, a former GM executive renowned for creating the Pontiac GTO and the Firebird, envisioned a car that combined futuristic style with an American interpretation of European exotic design. The DMC-12 was intended to be the embodiment of innovation. Stainless steel body panels, gull-wing doors, a rear-mounted V6 designed by Peugeot, Renault, Volvo, and an appearance so striking that it instantly became iconic. It was not just a car, it was a statement, a declaration that American industry could still dream big in the post-industrial 1980s. Yet from the start, the project was precarious. DeLorean had struggled to find funding, ultimately relying on a mix of private investors, British government loans, and tax incentives tied to the car's promised economic impact in Northern Ireland. Production started in 1981 at the Derry factory in Northern Ireland, a facility built specifically to meet the goals of employment and industrial revitalization set by the government. The car was produced in extremely limited numbers, and even at the best of times, the company struggled to meet quality standards, deadlines, and sales targets. Everything changed in 1982. John DeLorean was arrested in a highly publicized FBI sting operation, accused of attempting to finance a large-scale cocaine trafficking scheme to save his faltering company. Although he was ultimately acquitted, the damage was immediate and irreversible. Investors fled, suppliers cut off deliveries, and production ceased almost overnight. The DMC-12, which had existed in such a fragile commercial ecosystem, could not survive without its charismatic founder's credibility intact. In practical terms, this was a ban. The car could not be legally or practically produced anymore. It wasn't illegal to drive a DMC-12, and no government had prohibited its sale, but the combination of legal chaos, halted funding, and supplier collapse meant that the factory doors closed for good. Once the arrest occurred, it became impossible for anyone to continue the business. Employees were laid off, inventories were frozen, and unsold cars sat in warehouses, unable to reach buyers. Even existing units became difficult to support. Spare parts were scarce, warranties effectively null, and the company itself vanished. The DeLorean story is unique because it highlights how non-technical factors, legal crises, reputation, and criminal investigations can effectively ban a vehicle from existence. The DMC-12 was fully engineered, tested, and roadworthy. It had already passed all relevant safety and emissions regulations, and it was legally saleable. Its disappearance had nothing to do with consumer safety, product defect, or regulatory prohibition. It was a direct consequence of human error, legal entanglement, and the collapse of corporate confidence. The result is that the DeLorean became an instant rarity. Only about 9,000 units were ever built, and most of those were completed before the arrest. The cars that did reach the public became instantly collectible, partially because of the car's unique design, partially because of the mythos surrounding DeLorean himself. Every DMC-12 carried with it the aura of a project destroyed, not by engineering failure, market indifference, or law, but by scandal. It was an automotive casualty of crime, courtroom drama, and corporate implosion. The story also cemented the DeLorean's cultural status. Its later fame in Back to the Future immortalized it as a vehicle of fantasy and rebellion, a car whose existence and disappearance were inextricably tied to narrative drama. In many ways, the arrest and company collapse were as important to the car's legend as its gull-wing doors and stainless steel body. Without that episode, the DMC-12 might have become a minor exotic, admired for style, but ultimately forgotten. Instead, it became a symbol of ambition, hubris, and the fragility of automotive dreams in the modern age. In short, the DMC-12 was banned by circumstance. Its production was forcibly halted, not because of regulatory intervention, not because of technical failure, but because the founders' legal troubles made continuation impossible. It remains one of the clearest examples in automotive history of a car's existence being terminated by human scandal rather than mechanical or legal limitation. The AMC Gremlin occupies a peculiar and uncomfortable niche in American automotive history because while it was never officially outlawed or targeted by regulators, it was effectively removed from serious consideration by the court of public opinion. In a way, it was banned not by law, not by government intervention, but by a combination of design choices, safety shortcomings, and consumer revulsion, a market-enforced prohibition. Introduced in 1970 as AMC's attempt to compete with the growing wave of compact cars from Europe and Japan, the Gremlin was designed to be cheap, small, and distinctive. Its truncated rear end gave it a quirky, instantly recognizable silhouette, and AMC pitched it as a fun, youthful alternative to the larger, more conservative domestic sedans. But the car's design, while memorable, was fundamentally flawed from the start. The chopped rear compromised structural integrity, particularly in rear collisions. The frame and body panels were flimsy compared to competitors, and the materials used were often inconsistent in quality. Unlike more sophisticated small cars, the Gremlin had minimal attention to crumple zones, side impact resistance, or occupant protection. Safety testing at the time quickly revealed just how poorly the car performed. Crash tests demonstrated a tendency for the body to fold unpredictably, especially at the rear. The fuel tank placement behind the rear axle but without sufficient reinforcement made rear-end collisions particularly hazardous. Combined with basic suspension design and narrow track width, the Gremlin felt unstable in emergency maneuvers. Even skilled drivers reported that sudden swerves could produce unsettling oversteer, making the car feel as though it might tip or spin when pushed. In an era when safety standards were becoming increasingly visible to the public, this was damning. Beyond structural weaknesses, reliability and quality control were problematic. Engines and transmissions, while mechanically simple, were often installed with uneven tolerances, resulting in oil leaks, overheating, or premature wear. Interior finishes were cheap and prone to rapid deterioration. Build inconsistency across units meant that some Gremlins were relatively harmless, while others were unpredictable machines, prone to sudden mechanical failure. In essence, buying a Gremlin felt like playing a lottery with one's personal safety as the prize, or more accurately, the loss. Consumer perception, unsurprisingly, was brutal. Early advertising portrayed the Gremlin as playful and youthful, but the underlying reality undermined the message. Reports of poor handling, susceptibility to collisions, and general fragility circulated widely in automotive magazines and word of mouth. Unlike cars like the Mustang or Volkswagen Beetle, the Gremlin did not inspire confidence. Its appearance alone, oddly truncated, almost cartoonish, reinforced the sense that it was not serious. Buyers who prioritized safety, reliability, or longevity instinctively avoided it. Over time, this created a form of market enforcement akin to a ban. Dealerships struggled to sell the cars at any price, fleet buyers rejected them, and rental agencies refused to consider them for public use. While AMC kept producing the Gremlin through 1978, the vehicle's market share remained modest and confined largely to buyers willing to accept its quirks, eccentricities, and inherent dangers. In many ways, the Gremlin was legally available, but socially prescribed. People feared it enough to ensure its marginalization. The irony is that the Gremlin's limitations were not purely accidental. AMC had a limited budget and aimed to produce something visually distinctive while keeping costs low. Safety and refinement were secondary considerations, a compromise for speed to market and affordability. The result was a car that technically complied with minimal federal safety requirements of the era, but fell far short of consumer expectations. The public's rejection functioned as an invisible regulatory hand, removing the car from widespread circulation even when no formal ban existed. Today, the Gremlin is remembered with a mix of nostalgia and derision. It represents a moment when American automakers tried to quickly respond to imported competition, often without the engineering sophistication or resources to do so safely. Its legacy is not one of innovation or success, but of a car that became socially and commercially banned by the fear it inspired. A cautionary tale in how public perception can enforce limits more strictly than any government mandate.